Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Our next session is a panel discussion with Virginia's Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry, Ms. Bettina Ring, and Virginia's Secretary of Natural Resources, Mr. Matt Strickler. And this panel discussion is going to be moderated by Mr. Joe Maroon, who we mentioned previously is the Executive Director of the Virginia Environmental Endowment. Let me start by introducing our panelists first. Governor Ralph Northam appointed Bettina Ring in 2018 to serve as the fourth Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry for the Commonwealth of Virginia. In this capacity, she supports the governor's mission of building a strong Virginian economy in agriculture and forestry, two of Virginia's largest private industries, while also protecting the environment. Prior to her appointment, Secretary Ring was appointed by former Governor Terry McAuliffe to serve as the seventh state forestry for the Department of Forestry. During her term leading the agency, Secretary Ring secured $27 million in funding for emergency response equipment used to fight forest fires and to assist localities and other state agencies. A Virginia native, Secretary Ring began her career with VDOF and has held a number of leadership positions, including that Deputy State Forester during her 18 years with the agency. Now, prior to VDOF, Secretary Ring was a Senior Vice President of Family Forest at the American Forest Foundation, a position responsible for overseeing American Tree Farm System, the largest and oldest sustainable woodland program in America. She served on the Federal Forest Resource Coordinating Committee, which provides direction within the U.S. Department of Agriculture and with the private sector to effectively address national priorities for private forest management. Secretary Ring has also served as Executive Director of the Bay Area Open Space Council in San Francisco and was the Executive Director of the Colorado Coalition of Land Trusts. She holds a bachelor's degree in forestry and wildlife from Virginia Tech and a master's of business administration from James Madison University. Thank you for joining us today, Secretary Ring. Matt Strickler is the Secretary of Natural Resources for the Commonwealth of Virginia. Prior to joining the administration, he served as Senior Policy Advisor to Democratic members of the House of Representatives Committee on Natural Resources. Originally from Lexington, Matthew graduated from Washington and Lee University and holds a master's degree in public policy and marine science from the College of William and Mary and the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, respectively. He was a NOS Marine Fellow in the National NOAA's Office of International Affairs in 2007 and worked on U.S. Senator Mark Warner's successful 2008 campaign. Immediately prior to his time on Capitol Hill, Matt worked in the Virginia General Assembly as a legislative assistant to then State Senator Ralph Northam. Thank you also, Secretary Strickler, for participating in today's conference. Finally, our moderator is Mr. Joe Maroon. Joe is the Executive Director of the Virginia Environmental Endowment, a position he has held since 2013. As we all know, VEE is a philanthropic foundation based in Richmond that makes grants to improve the environment. Joe has over 35 years of experience in natural resources leadership positions, where he's previously served as state agency director of the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation for an 8-year period. He also was the first Virginia executive director of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and had his own environmental consulting practice. He has helped pass or implement a number of environmental and conservation initiatives. Until recently, he also taught graduate courses in environmental policy and Chesapeake Bay issues at the University of Virginia and Virginia Tech. Joe has received several awards for his work, including being among the very first recipients of the Urschel Environmental Leadership Award in 2000. In 2010, the Virginia General Assembly passed a resolution commending him for his years of service. In 2018, Joe was inducted into the National Association of Conservation Districts Hall of Fame in recognition of his career and extensive services. So, Joe, thank you for moderating this session today. I'm going to turn it over to you to begin.
Thank you, Colonel Gray. As you know, VEE has been a proud sponsor of this conference since the very beginning. And let me say how much we appreciate the leadership that you and Kim Conley and the VMI team provide year in and year out in pulling this together, especially this challenging year. As we've heard before, this conference is really one of the best state environmental conferences in the country for both the content and its ability to attract participants from all parts of the larger environmental community. So we're very grateful again for all of your work and that of the VMI team. Also want to take a brief minute just to congratulate Skip Stiles on being this year's Urschel Award recipient. It was my honor and with great admiration to be able to nominate him for the work that he and Wetlands Watch have been doing for many years. And I can't think of a more deserving individual. So congratulations to Skip. And Secretary Ring and Secretary Strickler, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your service to the Commonwealth. It's been a privilege to be asked to moderate this session, and I look forward to the next 45 minutes for our discussion. We're going to start with some general questions, and then we'll head into the specifics. I really think this discussion will provide an excellent overview to many of the topics that are covered more in depth in other sessions. And finally, to our audience, please use the online chat feature to submit your questions. Lieutenant Colonel Conley will be monitoring it, and we hope to have perhaps 10 or 15 minutes at the end for the secretaries to be able to answer your questions. So there's lots of ground to cover, and let's get started. It's been 2 years since we last met in Environment Virginia. A number of very consequential things happened during those past 2 years, including the challenges of the pandemic, both socially and economically, increased calls for racial and social justice, new state legislative majorities, a hotly contested national election, and so on and so forth. Let's begin by asking each of you to address how the events of the past 2 years have affected or changed the way that you or your secretariat has carried out its work. Secretary Ring, would you like to start, please?
I'd be happy to start. And I would, before I get started, just like to echo your remarks and thank everyone at VMI who continues to put on this tremendous conference year after year. And it is unfortunate that we're not able to be together this year and last year. Or when I'm able to do the same. We know it has been a challenging year. And Joe, just want to thank you for your tremendous leadership. I think it's an honor for both Secretary Strickler and I to be able to join you for all the great leadership you've provided and for the work that you're continuing to support. And I'm sure our conversation will bring this up time and time again to help us to advance the many priorities we have in front of us as it relates to natural resources, Chesapeake Bay protection, and land conservation, the work that you do through BEE. So knowing it's been a challenging year and it's been just a little over a year for us here in Virginia. And I think back to where we were a year ago. We had the Governor's Ag Trade Conference on a Tuesday. And by the end of the week, the next day I was in a Board of Forestry meeting, my phone was pinging, UVA was beginning to close classes and ask faculty and students to leave. And by the end of the week, the governor was putting restrictions in place. So we know we've had a challenging year, but I think we're very fortunate to have had Governor Northam a medical doctor as our leader during this time. His calm demeanor, the fact that he believes in and trusts science and data and has relied on that every step of the way to make some very difficult decisions, it's made all the difference. And I think you can see where we are now in Virginia compared to some other states. We've done well as far as being fiscally conservative. We've also been very thoughtful, I think, in addressing testing, rollout, even though we've all had certainly some things we've had to overcome there. So when you look at kind of what we were experiencing in our roles, certainly in agriculture and forestry, much was taking place. We were quickly working with other secretariats to look at essential businesses. How do we define non-essential businesses? Where do we put restrictions in place? And where do we need to make sure that we're keeping supply chains open? For example, in the ag and forestry world, we needed to make sure we were continuing to keep that entire supply chain open because it's also connected. So making sure that we were able to feed our children, our families, the most vulnerable, our seniors, and we continue to work on that. We still do with those numbers increasing during the pandemic. But it really required a lot of communications around that. And then also looking at the many forest products that we rely on, toilet paper, tissues, paper towels, other things that I think people were starting to pay even more attention to, and sometimes hoarding those items at home. But I think people started to think more about where their food was coming from and wanting to support local businesses. So as challenging as it was, we also had many silver linings that I think we can carry into the post-pandemic, if you will. And then just quickly, as far as our agencies, we're fortunate that in natural resources and forestry, our folks are working outdoors, right? The Department of Forestry didn't really skip a beat in continuing to serve their customers. They were also working very closely with VDM behind the scenes to help manage the situation because of their emergency response experience. And so they still to this day are helping with the COVID vaccination rollout and some of the planning and logistics. So it really took all hands on deck, if you will. VDAC's working very closely to address testing with our industries across the state to keep our farm workers safe early on. And I think, again, the silver linings, we've had many where people have had to adjust. We've had to think differently about how we order food. Our farmers markets, many farmers being able to go online or to have pickups where they've actually had increased business in some cases, and wineries that have had a better winter than they've ever had, knowing that they have many challenges and we have a lot of rebuilding to do. And I think what we're most excited about, I think Secretary Strickler would agree, is that more people are getting outdoors. They're enjoying the trails, the wonderful forests, and the wonderful parks that we have, our state parks, our state forests, but also what we have at the national and local level, and that system that we have in place. So back to you, Joe.
Great, thank you. We'll cover some more of that territory, I think, a little bit later. How about you, Secretary Strickler?
Well, Joe, thanks for this important question, and thanks for moderating the panel today. It's great to see you. Bettina, obviously great to be on here with you. And thanks to Kim and Colonel Gray and the VMI team. It's a bummer to not be able to be back home in Lexington with you all this year. And it's one of those things, you kind of take for granted that you're going to have an opportunity to do this each year when you start this job. And we got two under our belts, and then last year was a wash, and this year it's good to be doing this virtually. But I think particularly because of this question and because of some of these issues, Lexington would be a very impactful place to have these types of discussions. Growing up there, you're surrounded by the vestiges of the Old South. You're surrounded by the vestiges of our country's history of racism and divisiveness. And, both of the colleges in town, both the one that hosts this conference that my dad taught at or worked at for 38 years, and the one where I went to college are really having to go through a reckoning period right now with respect to a lot of the symbols, in the case of Washington and Lee, the name of the college, and they're going to have to make some very tough decisions about how, they interpret that stuff for people and what decisions they make, and it's going to impact the future of some flagship institutions in our Commonwealth. So, I think the calls for racial justice and kind of the reawakening or reckoning that we're having around these issues in our country have really accelerated for me personally some of the ongoing work that we've been doing in the areas of environmental justice and historic justice. I mean, we came in, to this administration with a goal of building environmental justice into the work we did, particularly at the Department of Environmental Quality, but really across state government. And that's something that, there's been added attention on. There have been some tense conversations about specific issues. And that's, that's good. It's good to have open and honest dialogue. I think the Environmental Justice Advisory Council that the Governor Northam continued and then worked with the General Assembly to make permanent has been really, really important. The Interagency Environmental Justice Work Group that we've had going on for the past year has been good in kind of getting that outside of just the Department of Environmental Quality and into other agencies. And, we're doing a lot of good work, in that space and also on the historic justice front. I mean, the Department of Historic Resources, which I know is not, something that a lot of the folks or an entity that a lot of folks at this conference work closely with, but, being able to be in a position to have their resources, their expertise, and tell some of the untold stories, of folks in the Commonwealth from diverse backgrounds has been really, really important and really impactful for me. So those are two things that I've focused a lot on, under the current circumstances, and I think we're making really good progress. With COVID, as Secretary Ring mentioned, there've been a lot of challenges. There've been a lot of differences. We've had to deal with disaster relief for watermen, getting that out the door and trying to help those folks stay afloat, literally and figuratively during these hard times. I was the beach czar for a little while there last spring, trying to come up with guidelines for how we keep our beaches open to people who, have been cooped up in their apartments and houses and need to get outside and spend a lot of time on that. And I think we were successful in walking the line, between having some beach access and not becoming Miami Beach at spring break. And I think the parks, and as Tina mentioned, our trails, keeping those open, but particularly the parks, it's just hard when you've got that kind of infrastructure, campgrounds, cabins, picnic shelters, and trying to balance, bathhouses, trying to balance, okay, how much of this do we want to keep open and give people an opportunity to take advantage of the resources during this time when they really need it, versus those becoming, hubs for spreading the disease. So I think we walked that line really well. I can't take a ton of credit for that. Clyde Chrisman and his team at DCR really did an amazing job of coming up with good recommendations and good protocols. So I think that's been really important. The couple other things I think that the pandemic has helped us and kind of forced us to do, one is to over communicate. And I think that's been really important, particularly with stakeholders, and we'll talk more about examples of some of the work we're doing later, but you're really cognizant of the fact that you're not around people all the time. And so you've actually got to make a cognizant or a concerted effort to reach out to them and stay in contact and make sure that nothing's getting lost in translation over email. And the other is, as Bettina said, it's reminded people of the value of nature, of how important the outdoors are in your life and how necessary they are for public health, mental health, physical health. And I think that's something that, hopefully is a silver lining coming out of this, that we really refocus and understand, as communities, as the Commonwealth, and as a nation, the value of protecting, particularly public lands for people to enjoy.
Great, thank you both for that. I think we're coming out of we hope coming out of the COVID pandemic, we're also in the home stretch for this administration. And so it's, I'm sure, a little bittersweet for both of you. This is potentially, we hope, perhaps not, your last Environment Virginia conference. You still have 9 months to go. But Secretary Strickler, without repeating the governor's impressive list that he detailed for us yesterday, what do you consider to be among the top 3 to 5 accomplishments of your agencies and the Secretariat this past 3+ years? And the second part of that is, what major items are left to be done that you hope will still be accomplished before next January?
Got it. Well, I didn't know I was going to be limited to three to five going into this this question, and we've got a lot. So I do understand that people heard the governor speak yesterday, and I do want to kind of build on that a little bit and hit some points that he didn't, but some of them bear repeating. So I'll just go quickly. I mean, we've been able to get, work with the General Assembly to get historic funding for water quality, land conservation, environmental protection, and including environmental justice, our natural heritage program. So the budget stuff has been really great. We got $10 million for oyster restoration in the capital budget. That's Virginia's first official natural capital investment, which is for folks who track that kind of stuff and are nerds about it like I am. It sets a really important precedent because now we know that natural and nature-based and green infrastructure are things that we can build in to the capital budget and things that the General Assembly now accepts as being capital expenditures. So that's something that I think is really worth stressing. You know, we weathered the storm of federal rollbacks under the Trump administration and actually strengthened many of Virginia's environmental regulations. We've developed and started implementing the strongest Chesapeake Bay cleanup plan in Virginia's history. We got 20 million plus tons of coal ash out of unlined dumps along our rivers. The Conserve Virginia initiative is a groundbreaking land conservation model that we've developed from scratch, basically starting with our natural heritage program and now codified to prioritize land conservation. We've transitioned to clean power generation through VCEA and RGGI, and we're dedicating all of that RGGI money to energy efficiency and flood preparedness with a focus on equity. Obviously, I mentioned the EJ work. We've done great work on marine resources with the Menhaden move out of the General Assembly and with to VMRC and restoring striped bass populations. We've saved the state's largest migratory bird colony and put in place last week a migratory bird protection rule that's going to require compensatory mitigation for take or habitat damage. Transportation decarbonization, we're starting to take some really big steps there. We've spent a lot of money through the Volkswagen settlement on electric buses, port equipment, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and of course recently got the clean cars legislation passed. And of course, I think most recently putting the state government on a path to dramatically reducing plastic pollution, which is something that's really important. All of that in addition to our flood preparedness and coastal, our coastal master planning effort, which is really groundbreaking as well. So on the to-do list, I think building on clean transportation, we're looking forward to continuing the Transportation and Climate Initiative process and hopefully getting to an MOU with the other states on kind of the RGGI for cars concept, hopefully modernizing the state vehicle fleet, getting the whole Chesapeake Bay partnership up to the state where Virginia is, and making sure that everybody's cleanup plans are on par with ours, and working with Secretary Ring to tackle one of the things that I think we are behind on, frankly, in Virginia, which is forested riparian buffers. We really need to get moving on that, and we've got goals in the Bay program that we've committed to, and we're lagging on that. So that's something that I think is important. And then finally setting our agencies up for success in the future. We've got an aging workforce. We have great leadership, but there's a new generation that needs to come along and guide Virginia's environmental agencies. So trying to make that transition and working to implement the One Virginia plan as well, which I think we'll talk more about today, and building in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I know that's a lot. Thank you for letting me get that all out, but it's important to kind of catalog all the things we've been working on, I think.
Well, and I'm glad you did. Not everyone heard the governor's remarks, so thank you for that, for sure. Secretary Ring?
So I would just add on, we've had so much that we've been able to accomplish in this short period of time. And if you just look across the board at everything the governor's been able to advance, and so much of it is connected, and making sure that we continue to work together on implementation. Some things that really stand out for us, certainly our hardwood initiative that we were able to get successfully across the finish line, working with our Board of Forestry, working with many of our partners. We know we've had a long history of reforestation in Virginia. on the pine side, done a great job in managing our pines, but 80% of our forests in Virginia are hardwood. And so we need to turn our attention more to that and to make sure that we are doing all that we can to address hardwood management in the state. And that can be challenging, it can be costly. So for the first time ever, we're going to have incentives in place. It's truly a legacy item for the governor to be able to have incentives for our landowners, our private landowners, to be able to put some pilots in place, to be able to put some practices in place that perhaps they haven't used in the past, and to address invasives, to address the many challenges we have as it relates to our hardwood forests. So extremely proud of that. We've done a lot of work, and much of our work is so connected. So at first glance, it may not seem like, oh, you're talking about food, you may not be talking directly about the environment, but we know how connected our food systems are to the environment. And looking at the progress that we've made, again, in feeding all people and addressing the additional needs that we've had during the pandemic, but some of the programs we've been able to advance that we're very excited about. The Roadmap to End Hunger, working with Department of Social Services, the First Lady with the governor's our cabinet, our children's cabinet, and that was a product that came out of that that's really going to make a difference in the future. Looking at new programs to address food deserts and making sure that we're addressing those not only in urban areas but in rural areas across the state. So rolling out that food access grant program, and then just most recently another food access program to connect food banks and our farmers who are donating products and to reimburse them for some of the expenses that they have. So many things that are connected. Secretary Strickler talked about riparian buffers. We have a heavy lift as it relates to that. All of the states do. There are a number of reasons for that. If you look at sort of our trajectory for Chesapeake Bay and what's been required as far as goals and also budget cuts over time. But we need additional capacity. We need more seedlings out there. Unfortunately, we were able to receive one-time funding to increase our capacity at the Augusta Forestry Center to be able to grow more trees. And now there's more demand for climate, for the many benefits that we get from our trees. So we're going to have to continue to work on that. I know Ann and others spoke to the challenges we have ahead of us as it relates to the Chesapeake Bay, but we also have some great opportunities in front of us. So those are just a few things I'd like to highlight.
Well, you both will leave quite a legacy, and certainly the governor will in both of your secretariats. Well, one of the things that we often rely on in state government is our partnership with the federal government. Secretary Ring, I know it's a little early, but tell us how, if at all, the new administration in Washington may have already affected the work of you and your agencies.
Well, I think you'll probably can guess what's at the top of my list. We're very excited that President Biden has nominated our Ag Commissioner, Dr. Jewel Renaud, to be the first ever African-American female Deputy Secretary of USDA. And she's a tremendous leader. Many of you have worked with her over the years. She has an extension and ag background. She's been the director of the Farm Services Agency, as well as Dean of Ag at Virginia State University, and in a partnership role there as well. So we're excited about what Jewel's going to bring into that role as soon as she's confirmed. And I don't want to get ahead of myself because her confirmation keeps getting pushed back, and that will take place soon in April at the latest. But we are very pleased that she was tapped and know that she's going to do so much. She's worked in a short period of time to address farmer suicide, some of the mental health issues that or challenges that we have with our farmers and the challenges that face them. Looking at urban agriculture, addressing food deserts, and doing more to reach minority farmers and producers. And we know that Biden's putting more attention on that. We're very excited about that. Secretary Vilsack, who has returned to his role as secretary, has been clear about that during the nomination process with their priorities. We can already see the investments they're making in addressing food security. Climate, no question, the climate team that they put in place. I know Secretary Strickler and I are very excited about that, knowing that Robert Bonney from Virginia is a big part of that as well, as Assistant Chief of Staff, really on the climate team. And I think looking at the work that he did as being an undersecretary in USDA under President Obama, being at Duke, doing the climate work that he was doing, and then bringing that back to this administration, I think the future is really bright there. Having the first ever Native American Secretary of the Interior, and what that's going to bring to our future as it relates to that work. So I'm very excited about the appointments, about the investments that are being made, focus on green jobs and land conservation. I think there's much more to come.
Secretary Strickler, how about you? Do you know the incoming EPA administrator, for example?
I do know Administrator Regan from his time as my counterpart in North Carolina. He's fantastic. I think the world of him. He's going to do an amazing job, and it's just so refreshing to have someone with his, not only his background, but his expertise in that position. So, yeah, I mean, Bettina hit all the high points there. I don't need to belabor it, but it's incredibly helpful. I mean, we as states have been carrying this incredible burden for the last 4 years of leadership on climate, on leadership of clean air, clean water. And now we're able to have somebody that can help us share that burden and actually take the baton and lead, which is, you know, the role of the federal government after all. So it's a huge help. It's obviously very helpful to know some people that are in the administration and be able to kind of help Virginia navigate that. But so far so good, and looking forward to, you know, to more great collaboration.
Great. You know, one of the real challenges that's facing state government, and let's face it, really all of society, we'll be dealing with it for years to come. We'll be tackling diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And we just would love to hear what you think some of the near-term actions you and your agencies are planning to take. Secretary Ring, how about you?
Sure. And you heard from Secretary Strickler already some of the emphasis that's being placed within our administration. I think it's just, we're at a unique time, and in some ways, we've had many challenges in our administration, but we also, I think, are leading in ways that other states are not. And so I'm very proud of the fact that we have this One Virginia plan that we're all going to be integrating into our agencies and into our work, and to know that it's the first of its kind in the nation, to know that the first ever director, a chief diversity officer, has been added to a cabinet level position for diversity, equity, inclusion with Dr. Underwood, and the work that she's doing with her team, the work that she did with our stakeholders to be able to pull this plan together. And you'll be hearing more about that. You can access it through the website, but I think it shows that it's more than just a one-off here and there. It's more than just recruiting and making sure that our workforce represents the communities that we're serving, but it's really going to be integrated in everything that we do, and is long overdue. So we're excited about working together on that. Something that we've been very proud of is our work with the Black Family Land Trust, addressing heirs property issues. And we know just last session, not this past one, but last year, we were able to see a bill come together working with the Black Family Land Trust, seeing the work that they were doing with the land trust community, and also working with the Uniform Law Commission to be able to pass the Uniform Petition Act for heirs property, to begin to remove some of the barriers that are in place, but also to be able to get more federal funding to assist with the state planning and some of those issues that we've had, and to be able to have the governor sign that, have a ceremonial bill signing at Ralph Sampson's property in Rockingham County, and what he was able to do to bring his land back intact. Again, those tools are very important. Just recently, we worked with the Institute for Engagement and Negotiation, the Governor's Summit for Equitable Collaboration. We were pleased. We had over 1,000 individuals participating in that. We had an opportunity to hear from some inspirational speakers like Dr. Mamie Parker, in addition to Dr. Underwood and the governor. Being able to listen to case studies, being able to think about policy in some places where we need to make some changes, as the governor likes to say, where we can do better and be better. And I think some of what's coming out of that, we're going to be able to sit down as cabinet secretaries and really take a look at that and see what can we implement? Where do we need to make changes in programs, policies, procedures? Where do we perhaps need to put an executive order in place? And so I'm really excited about that, and would like to give IEN a shout out for the great work that they did on that. It was the 40th anniversary of IEN, as well as the 20th anniversary of the Virginia Natural Resources Leadership Institute. And it was a great way to really celebrate that and to, I think, set a path for the future. And I think looking at the work that we've done with marijuana legalization, our secretary helped lead that, along with some other cabinet secretaries, working with our stakeholders. And I think what came out of the study that we developed, because we were very thoughtful about the stakeholders that were engaged in that, we were very thoughtful about the social equity components of that and looking at other states and learning from them so that we could do it the Virginia way. resulted in some legislation that's still being discussed and hasn't been signed. And we know that we have a veto session coming up and more conversations taking place. But it is really being recognized as one of the best as far as addressing social equity. And so we'll be very thoughtful moving forward in how that's implemented. And so that's just a few of the examples, food access, food justice, the work that we've done there and will continue to do, and that our agencies are doing. VDAX is one of the pilots for One Virginia. The Department of Forestry has been doing a lot with Hector Rivera, who's the HR director there, with Rob Farrell's leadership as state forester, and a lot of the work we're doing with addressing heat islands and redline communities. So I think Secretary Strickler and I could spend the rest of our time talking about the great progress that our agencies have made, but we know we have much more work to do. So thank you.
Great. And I'm sure, Secretary Strickler, you could add a lot to that. Looking at the time, I thought we might go on unless you had a word that you wanted to add in particular about
I'll just add really quickly, a couple of things specifically that we're working on in natural resources. We have a very kind of forward-leaning initiative at the Chesapeake Bay program on DEIJ. Miriam Karad in my office is actually leading, co-chairing the action team on this. And so we're looking to build on the governor's, the executive council action from last year to put together a final kind of implementation plan for this vision for DEIJ Bay program and diversifying, the universe of kind of environmental practitioners. And we've also done a lot around conservation law enforcement over the last few years. We asked the Inspector General to audit this because we knew it was a problem. Our law enforcement agencies in our 3 branches with law enforcement divisions are overwhelmingly white and male. And that's not what we need to diversify the environmental movement. We need, people who look like the communities and look like the individuals we want to bring into the parks and out onto the water and into our game reserves. So, we're doing a lot of great work there, and I won't get too deep into it now, but more to come on that.
Great, thank you. Very, very aggressive agenda. Let's turn, we both have mentioned Chesapeake Bay. Secretary Strickler, as you well know, Virginia's made a lot of progress. There's still a ways to go, long ways in some ways. Runoff from farms and development in particular proven to be more difficult than anticipated, and it's going to take considerably more funding and effort, even with all of the good work that you all have done these past 3.5 years, if we're going to meet our 2025 goals, and which of course now are just a few short years away. So my question really is, are you optimistic that Virginia and its partners can meet the pollution reductions called for in the Bay TMDL? And if so, what needs to be done to get us to the goalpost? And I know that Governor Northam is the chair of this year of the Regional Bay Partnership. Maybe you might want to even elaborate a little bit about what he'll be doing to help us get to that to the end post.
Sure, Joe. I think the short answer is for Virginia, I do feel optimistic. For the partnership, I'm still hopeful, but maybe a little bit less optimistic. We've been very proactive in the Commonwealth in dealing with some of our really tough challenges. We've got, I think, really good backstops in place, and our governor has proposed to increase some funding, got that proposed increase with some additional, cherry on top from the General Assembly on ag BMPs this year. So I think we're continuing to make really, really good investments there. Hopefully with our federal partners, supplementing that, we can meet those goals. We've, we're just had legislation, that basically does the same thing that our regulatory process would have done to improve water quality at wastewater treatment plants. But we're getting to that one way or another, and making some significant investments there. And then obviously putting a bunch of money into stormwater, while at the same time building in the climate projections that show we're going to have more loads in the future, nutrient loads from increased rainfall in the watershed. And so, we have not seen that same proactive approach, frankly, on climate from other states. I think some states are, other states are a little bit behind us on grabbing that bull by the horns. you all, I don't think I need to get too deeply into the fact that we've got, one big state that produces a lot of pollution that does not have a plan in place that would reduce that pollution. And there's some, I guess, legal wrangling over that hopefully will get resolved now that we've got a new EPA administrator. So, there's a lot to be done, and I think getting everybody on track, and importantly, as I mentioned earlier, green infrastructure, natural capital. If there is an infrastructure package that moves through Congress to the president, I really, really hope that they look at our water quality infrastructure, both the gray water treatment, wastewater, stormwater infrastructure, but also our green infrastructure. We can put a lot of people to work and get a lot of good out of restoring wetlands, planning and restoring forested riparian buffers, things like that. And so it's restoring streams. And I think there's a lot to be said for making sure that that's a big component of federal infrastructure spending. So I think there's some options out there for us to get the resources we need to accelerate the Bay cleanup effort. And so in general, I'm optimistic. There's a little bit of ball to be played.
Secretary Ring, this comes to mind, I think, especially given your unique perspective here, even though your agency isn't directly involved in the cost share program or the best management practices program, but you deal with farmers on a whole range of issues. Really Virginia's ability to meet its goals are going to depend on getting much more reductions from the agricultural sector. Do you have any thoughts that you would like to share with us about what you think could be done to help reach additional farmers and get more buy-in and participation?
I thank you for that question. I think it really is all hands on deck. Now, we know that we have, big lifts between now and 2025. We know much of this is falling on the shoulders of our ag community as far as expectations to get certain things across the finish line, additional nutrient management plans in place, additional fencing of cattle out of the streams. But I think it's really going to take the additional ag BMP funding, what the governor's proposed, the investments that he's made throughout his tenure is going to make a huge difference. The additional funding that came through in this past session will make a difference because we've had a number of years, and I can think about what I witnessed when I was at the Department of Forestry, but also as I was out west and then coming back, of sort of repeated budget cuts and the impact that's had, and how we have some catching up to do. And that's true across the board for much of the investments that we need in places. But I think it is working with extension, it's working with our soil and water conservation districts. It's really all of us being very thoughtful, building and maintaining trust relationships, listening to each other, thinking about, I think, really targeted outreach. That's true for riparian buffers and where we have gaps that we can make up and make some real progress. But when we think about our farmers and the farming community, that we look at those individuals that have relationships at the local level, and that we leverage those relationships in a very, with a lot of integrity around that, if you will, working with NRCS, working with soil and water again, really thinking about the strengths that our various agencies bring to the table, but not forgetting our stakeholders that are in touch with what's happening, staying in close contact, a lot of communications, and not giving up, I think is going to be really important.
A related question really is the fact that we appear to be in the middle of a generational change of ownership in our forest and farmland. And do you think that is going to have an impact on both the participation, but also what the administration might be doing to assist those families who want to continue to own that land so that there's not a major conversion of it to non-farm or non-forest use?
I do. I absolutely do. When you look at some of the examples that we have, you can just look in the Valley, for example, where you're seeing a transition of ownership, but you're also seeing other family members step up, if you will. And I think it is really important. I think it's great to see the excitement, the energy with our young farmers, their commitment to land stewardship, wanting to continue their family's commitment over time. And we know it can be challenging. You have to be very thoughtful about how you plan for, estate planning is not easy. It's difficult to have those conversations within a family, but we want to do all we can to keep that land intact and to be able to pass it down to that next generation if that's what the family chooses. So we're fortunate with the Department of Forestry and also VDACs. We have some great programs in place. We also have the FarmLink program in place that connects younger farmers that may not have grown up on a farm with individuals that may be retiring or selling their farm. And I think you're going to see that program expand in the future. The Generation Next program that we have at the Department of Forestry with Extension to provide estate planning services. We've worked with the Black Family Land Trust on that and reaching minority farmers. But I think I am very hopeful about the future and the excitement that you see with more people coming back to the land, if you will. And I think you see that during COVID, that some people are moving out of urban areas, wanting to be back in a rural community. We need to make sure, and the governor often says this, that we have jobs for those individuals, and many farmers have to work off the farm to be able to have health insurance and other things for their family members. And so it's really going to take all of us being very thoughtful about that. But I think you see a land ethic and also some new approaches, new farming techniques that these younger farmers are bringing into play. I think making sure that we're being flexible. I know we work very closely with Ann Jennings and with Secretary Strickler on making sure that we could have fencing that is not permanent fencing, but in places where we can have fences that we can move around based on if we're encouraging certain types of grazing, then we want to move the cattle around or move the livestock around. So thinking about our practices and how they line up, making sure that we have flexibility and we can adapt those practices. And I think our new NRCS director as well, being able to work with them on changes as far as cost share programs, in addition to DCR and soil and water conservation districts.
Yeah, would love to dive a lot deeper into each of these questions, but looking at the time here, let me see if we can get one or two more in before we go to the audience questions. Secretary Strickler, let me ask you this question. Virginia has received the first RGGI auction monies, $43 million, which was wonderful, money we didn't have. And now that the Clean Economy Act is a year old and major companies, many of whom are maybe represented here at the conference, have announced that they intend to be carbon neutral in the near future, what do you think the impact is going to be? And I understand the legislation calls for the funding for the use of those funds from the RGGI auction to broadly address climate resilience efforts and energy efficiency. But can you give us a little bit of insight on what you think that might look like this first go around?
Sure. So in general, I think it's going to be incredibly important. There's a lot of momentum for clean energy, and we've made incredible strides in the power generation sector. With respect to RGGI in particular, as you know, the legislation, the enabling statute there dedicated half of those funds to low-income energy efficiency programs. Those programs are being run through the Commerce Secretariat, the Department of Housing and Community Development, and in conjunction with DMME. And they already have existing weatherization programs and some other programs that they can get that money out through. And so that's what they're planning to do. I believe that they're probably going to start getting some money out the door relatively soon, and that's great. 45% of the revenue went to the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, and that's something that we have basically had to start from scratch. There was a precursor fund to this that was never capitalized, and since it never had any money, nobody ever wrote guidelines for how the money should be spent, and so we've had to do that. And we've put out an initial kind of draft, high-level guidance document. We've taken some really constructive public comment on that. And we're expecting at some point next month to have a draft grant manual and some more detailed guidelines on how we would do the first grant round from the 19 million and change that we got into that bucket from the RGGI money, and get those grants out the door. I think there's going to be on that side a big focus on planning. There are a lot of localities in Virginia who have not had the resources to be as proactive as a Virginia Beach or a Norfolk or a Hampton on flood preparedness and coastal resilience, and particularly a lot of our inland communities that are impacted by flooding. And we want to help them develop plans to prioritize the things that they need to protect, their approach to flood preparedness, and I think this will be a good opportunity to fund some of that work, and also hopefully start funding some projects that are identified as really critical to localities. And and regions across the Commonwealth.
Great. Again, I wish we had more time to go into all of this, but let me ask you one more question before we go to the audience questions. For both of you, what are one or two things that you learned working in state government and in the cabinet that you wish you knew walking in the door 3 years ago? And the second part of that, what advice would you like to pass along to the various stakeholders and agency staff and the public, for that matter, on how best to interact with the Secretary's office in the future?
Tina, you want to go
be happy
first?
to jump. You want to go first, Secretary Strickler? So I think that you feel a tremendous sense of urgency. And I think Secretary Strickler and I both can feel that clock ticking as far as, okay, you know, you have 9 months left to get some things across the finish line, to land some planes. But you come in, and I'll speak to the fact that I was a state director as state forester, and sort of the different perspective that you get coming into this role. I'm fortunate. I am happy that I had that agency experience, because I think it's important for us to remember the agencies are really the ones that do the work ultimately. So we want to remove the barriers that they have in front of them. We're their advocates. That's true as it relates to budget. It's true as it relates to legislation that impacts them. So we never want to forget that. And they're the ones that are implementing. So they may not be setting policy. That's much of our responsibility working with the governor, but thinking about who's going to implement that policy and making sure we're truly listening to them and that we're engaging them and our stakeholders as we make those decisions. And I think you realize that it's really important. I was very excited in having the opportunity to work with Governor Northam, because he was very clear in the very beginning that he wanted us to work in an integrated fashion. He even talked about early on whether we should mix our offices up, for example, and that never did completely come to fruition as far as us moving our teams around, because you have to have sort of that continuity in places. But I think you realize how important it is that a decision you make impacts someone else, or if you pull a thread and how that's going to impact someone else. And that's so true as it relates to the budget. And that, you know, you have to have that 30,000 level view, but then you have to not forget about the operational piece and making it a reality. I think that you need to not forget about the pieces related to policy, legislation, and the importance that those teams, the fiscal teams, have in final decision making, the policy teams, communication teams. All that piece is a package for the governor to be able to make sure that we're being thoughtful about our communications and how we're rolling things out. So there has to be a lot of internal communication, and you need to constantly be thinking, who else should be at the table? Who am I forgetting about? Those are the things you often lose sleep about at night. And then I think with our stakeholders, you know, I think it's really important for us to stay in touch. No surprises is what I don't think we like to be surprised from our agencies. We want them to keep us informed, but that's true for stakeholders as well. And to be able to come in with one voice, if you will, whenever possible. Whenever the ag community can be united, or the forestry community, it makes a difference. Sometimes we're all going to have to agree to disagree, but I think that's really important in staying in close contact and working through issues, finding common ground across secretariats as well.
Very good. Secretary Strickler?
So I think maybe the one thing that I would say is, you know, and I think this is true for Secretary Ring, well, now it's a virtual door, but my door is open, right? Like, maybe it's not, maybe you can't get to me, but you can get to somebody on my staff. And I think there's, you know, it was really surprising how hesitant, you know, a lot of, you know, folks, stakeholder groups were to, and have been to reach out to us on some topics. And I think that may be a product of the fact that there's some fairly significant gaps in coverage, frankly, by the environmental NGO community on issues in our secretariat across the Commonwealth. And it's not their fault. It's just, you know, they do what their funders ask of them, which is largely these days climate, clean energy, water quality, increasingly environmental justice. But, you know, coming from Capitol Hill, I was used to having a lot of folks beating on my door about fisheries issues, wildlife conservation, biodiversity, invasive species, solid waste. And those constituencies really need to be built in Virginia. I know that there are people in Virginia who care about that stuff, Certainly my agencies care about it. I know Secretary Ring's agencies care about it, particularly the invasive species issue. But we just don't hear a lot about that. And it's tough to move good public policy when you don't have kind of ready-made constituencies who are willing to work with you on advocacy. So that's a kind of a bigger picture issue that I think probably we need to have some longer conversations about. The other thing is to echo what Bettina said, our state agencies and the employees at our state agencies are great, particularly during COVID. I mean, they have been doing so much amazing work under really, really challenging circumstances. And I just can't say enough about them and the leadership at our agencies. And one thing that I didn't know coming into this job was how awesome the Department of Historic Resources is. We've been able to do such incredible work with them, and Julie Langan and her team are just incredible. So, just being positioned to again tell some of the stories about Virginia history that that folks are really wanting to hear has made that a really interesting partnership over these 3 years.
Secretary Strickler, didn't the legislature change your title actually of your secretariat?
It's true, they did. It'll be the Secretariat of Natural and Historic Resources come July 1st. And that's just, a really important acknowledgement of how significant historic resources are in the Commonwealth.
Very good. Thank you both. Let's see if we can go to Lieutenant Colonel Conley and see if she has any questions for you in the chat.
Sure. We don't have that many questions, and one was already answered in the course of your discussion. The two I have are very, very specific, so hopefully that you can answer them pretty quickly. The General Assembly provided a process to study how trees can be used for stormwater management. The state has not yet convened this advisory group that was to have started last fall. Can you comment on this advisory group schedule and why they can't meet online as we're doing now? Thank you very much for your service.
Sure, I can probably start with that one unless you want to, Bettina.
Sure, go ahead.
We get a lot of direction from the General Assembly on studies and work groups, and we're certainly happy to do all of it. The General Assembly was kind enough to grant us during the pandemic the authority to prioritize those studies, given the challenges associated with online meetings and all of the things that our agencies have had as additional burdens during the pandemic. And that is one of the ones that's been extended. So we understand that it's still an obligation of ours. It's something we want to do, but it just hasn't, we haven't had the bandwidth to make it happen yet. So we'll keep you posted.
Is there anticipated beginning that you can tell folks?
So right now I am in the process, and Secretary Ring was at the Conservation Cabinet meeting last week where we discussed this, of figuring out how to get probably 15 or 16 different studies and work groups off the ground. That's one of them. And I think we will have start dates for all of those probably within the next month.
Okay, here's another question. Do you think Virginia should have a state level planning office?
I'll jump in. I'm sure Secretary Strickler will want to elaborate. I think it depends on for what purpose. There are different ways to define planning. There's much we need to think about. I mean, there's planning that takes place with the local government and the local government level. There's planning that takes place within the Department of Planning and Budget, for example. They have a planning office that works with state agencies to ensure that they have strategic plans and metrics that are tied back to their budget. That we need to, I think, work across secretariats as it relates to land use planning. I think there are more opportunities in the future to be very thoughtful and strategic about that, and to think about in a Dillon law state, we do have some challenges as it relates to kind of what we do at the state level, how that impacts local government. But then how do we help local government with comprehensive land use planning? How do we improve those processes over time? And then, thinking about green infrastructure, that's, and you heard from the Green Infrastructure Center yesterday, Karen Firehawk, some of the work that we have going on in the Norfolk area that the Department of Forestry is involved with, and those planning efforts, being able to conduct plans for communities and then begin to implement those can make a huge difference. But I think I would be hesitant to put just a planning office at the state government because I would have a fear of being siloed. So I think it's something that needs to be integrated.
All right, I see we're at 1:30, Joe, so I'll turn it back over to you to close it up.
Very good. Well, I have a whole nother page of questions, and we covered quite a bit. Thank you both very much, and continued success to you and your agencies. And we also want to thank everyone that joined us, and we trust this session has been a help and informative to everyone. I think Colonel Gray gets the last word here.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Secretaries Ring and Strickler for some great insights today and for your leadership at Forestry and Natural Resources. Joe, as always, great to see you and greatly appreciate your great facilitation of this panel and your continuing support of Environment Virginia. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll now take a 15-minute break and we'll return at 1:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time for session number 7. So we'll see you then. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.